Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Swan Song by Robert R. McCammon. Now, Swan Song is a post-apocalyptic horror novel published in 1987. Now, Robert McCammon is also the author of books like Mine, Stinger, Usher's Passin', the Matthew Corbett series, and Boy's Life, which is one of my top 5 favorite books of all time. Now, Robert McCammon, I think, is a criminally underrated author. He was relatively big in the 80s, and he still has a pretty loyal fan base, but unfortunately he never became the household name that people like Clive Barker, Dean Koontz, and especially Stephen King would become. But in my opinion, he deserves to be just as well known and just as recognized by mainstream pop culture as those authors. And this and Boy's Life are probably his 2 most well-known books. Now, this is actually the 3rd review of this book that I've done on this channel. I first reviewed Swan Song all the way back in 2010. It was actually one of my first book reviews, and the video was fucking horrible because I didn't know what I was doing, so I redid it early in 2012, and that review was equally as atrocious. But as bad as that review was, it still came out when my channel was still in its relative infancy, and the video is actually kind of important to me because it was one of my first videos to get over 1,000 views, which I know today doesn't really mean shit. Also, I know the video did earn me some subscribers at the time, and I also got some people to check out the book because of my review. Also, and I know how pretentious and egotistical this is gonna sound, but I believe at the time I put that video up, there were very few actual reviews of Swan Song on YouTube. And I did get some pretty awesome comments on the video, including one from this one guy who said he actually read the book when he was in jail. But I also got some rather negative comments, and some of those comments I probably deserved a little bit, because I will say, if you watch my 2012 review of Swan Song, you could probably play a drinking game with how many times I say, or basically in the video, even though people don't seem to understand how hard it actually is to record a video straight through with no editing, because I didn't do any editing on my videos back then. People don't seem to understand that it's kind of impossible to do a video straight through without saying things like and basically. But if you want to check out my 2012 review of Swan Song, it's no longer public, but you could still see it with a link, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you could check out that review. Although, I don't recommend actually playing a drinking game with every time I say and basically, because you might die of alcohol poisoning then. Now, since this book was first published, it has been compared both favorably and unfavorably to Stephen King's The Stand. Now, a lot of the similarities between Swan Song and The Stand are just superficial. Some of them, however, can't be ignored, and Robert McCammon has admitted when he was writing Swan Song, he knew people were going to compare this to The Stand, but he also has said that he came up with this idea long before Stephen King published The Stand. Like, both books are post-apocalyptic novels, and while the thing that brings about the end of the world is completely different in both novels have very similar main villains, and even touch on a lot of similar themes and ideas. Although, to be honest, some of the things that Swan Song seems to take from The Stand are not even things that are unique to The Stand, but are just general tropes that you see throughout most post-apocalyptic fiction. But I'm gonna be honest, I actually like Swan Song better than The Stand. Don't get me wrong, The Stand is a great book. It's definitely one of Stephen King's best books, and it absolutely deserves its place in the pantheon of post-apocalyptic fiction. I just think as a post-apocalyptic novel, Swan Song is a much darker, much bleaker, more horrifying depiction of the end of the world, and while in The Stand, while the environment that the characters live in sucks, it's still, for the most part, livable, and ultimately in that novel, the main conflict that the characters have to deal with is Randall Flagg, whereas in Swan Song, every day these characters are fighting for survival, and every day it's a struggle to find food and water, so just as a post-apocalyptic novel, I think Swan Song is a much more effective work. I also think Swan Song, despite being about the same length as The Stand, is a much more fast-paced novel. But I love Swan Song. This is probably my second favorite post-apocalyptic novel behind Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, and it's my second favorite Robert McCammon novel behind Boy's Life. And this was my first Robert McCammon novel, and it was the book that made me a Robert McCammon fan. It was actually my aunt who introduced me to him. Like, she had a bunch of his books, which she gave to me. Like, it's an underrated as hell book, and it's a book that if you're a fan of post-apocalyptic fiction, you should definitely check this out, and if you just wrote this off because you heard it was a knockoff of The Stand, then you're doing yourself a massive disservice. Now, the plot of Swan Song is it's set in the not-too-distant future. Keep in mind the book was written in the 80s, which was sort of the height of the Cold War, so it was how the future looked at that time period, but basically in the novel's universe, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union eventually escalate to all-out nuclear war, bringing about the end of human civilization as we know it, and a nuclear winter. Now, the book is broken up into two halves. The first half of the novel is about the socio-political situation that eventually leads to the nuclear holocaust, and then the immediate aftermath. And then the second half of the novel jumps ahead to 7 years later. And the book has a very large ensemble cast of characters, but for the most part, it follows three pairs of characters as they make their way across this apocalyptic wasteland that was once the United States of America. And the book actually begins almost like three separate narratives that are running concurrently with each other, and then in the second half of the novel, the three narratives start to converge upon each other. Now, the main character of the novel is this girl named Sue Wanda Prescott, or Swan, which was the nickname her mother gave her, and she's a little girl in the beginning of the novel and is a teenager by the second half of the novel. But Swan's mother dies shortly after the bombs drop, and she's taken in by this man named Josh Hutchins, who, prior to the nuclear war, was a professional football player turned wrestler who went by the nickname Black Frankenstein because he's this very large African-American man. He's actually kind of a giant. But Josh becomes Swan's protector, and throughout the novel you realize that Swan has supernatural powers. She can actually bring life to dead vegetation, and as the novel progresses, she starts to realize that she may be the one thing that could prevent the human race from going extinct. The other pair of characters you follow is Colonel James B. Macklin and a young man named Roland Crowinger. Roland, prior to the nuclear holocaust, was this 14-year-old kid whose parents were basically doomsday preppers. They were part of a group of conspiracy theorists who thought that the world was going to end, and of course they were right. And Roland and his parents went to this place called Earth House, which was basically this massive nuclear bomb shelter, and that's where Roland met Colonel Macklin, who was a Vietnam War hero who was commissioned by the people who built Earth House to be, like, the main military commander of this place. But it turns out that the people who built Earth House were basically just scam artists, and the place was built like crap, so when nuclear war actually does break out, the entire place basically collapses in upon itself, and Roland and Colonel Macklin are the only two survivors of the destruction of Earth House. And eventually, Colonel Macklin and Roland form what they call the Army of Excellence, which, by the second half of the novel, novel is just this massive right-wing militia that wants to rebuild America in their image, and they're getting all these people to follow them, and anybody who doesn't follow them, they kill. And they're also executing anybody with severe radiation burns to basically erase the memories of what happened. And the third storyline in the novel follows this woman named Sister. You never find out what her real name was, and you get the idea that even she doesn't remember her real name. But prior to the bombs dropping, she was this crazed street preacher who people nicknamed Sister Creep, and after the bombs hit New York, she finds in the ruins of this department store this magical glass ring, which is showing her visions, possibly visions of the future. And she believes that God put this ring in her hands, and these visions are leading her to something or somebody. But throughout the novel, she's being pursued by a shape-shifting demon known as the Man with the Scarlet Eye, who may or may not be Satan himself. And now he will stop at nothing to destroy this ring and whatever the ring is leading Sister to, because it is the Man with the Scarlet Eye's mission to destroy all hope. Now, before I discuss this novel further, I just want to cut to a short review on this novel from my friend Mark Allan Gunnells, who's actually an author himself. Now, the interesting thing about him is he actually has sort of a tangential connection to Robert McCammon, because a few years ago, one of my friend Mark's stories appeared in an anthology alongside a Robert McCammon story.
Hello. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short review on the novel Swan Song by Robert McCammon. This was actually the first novel I ever read by Robert McCammon. I had heard wonderful things about it, so I went and bought it at Barnes & Noble and devoured it, and became, from that point, a lifelong Robert McCammon fan. I wouldn't say this is my absolute favorite book by McCammon, but it is right up there. It gets a lot of comparisons to Stephen King's The Stand, because it is a post-apocalyptic novel, and there are these two warring factions. But, you know, those similarities are rather superficial. They're very different stories, told very differently. They're both great novels. In Swan Song, the apocalypse happens through nuclear war, and the survivors are often, I don't want to say deformed, but they start getting this covering that covers their entire body. A lot of the stories focused on a young girl, Sue, or Swan, who seems to have the power to bring life to things. Like where she goes, grass grows. And she seems to hold the key to sort of revitalizing the world. But there are forces that are working against that, who want to stop that. And that is the basic sort of conflict in the novel. It is a wonderful novel. It is different in The Stand in that its approach is very different. The language is very different. It's almost more lyrical here, a little more poetic. And I just want to read it. It has one of my all-time favorite opening lines of any book. Once upon a time, we had a love affair with fire. That sort of language just really gets me, and I think it tells a very uplifting story about some very dark things. Don't think just because you've read The Stand, you don't need to read this. Like I said, very different books. Both of them are great. Definitely give this one a look.
So, in the novel, you have three prominent protagonists, Swan, Joshua, and Sister, and three prominent antagonists, Colonel Macklin, Roland Crowinger, and the Man with the Scarlet Eye. And I like how in the novel, the heroes and the villains are kind of like foils to each other. Like, if you look at the relationship between Colonel Macklin and Roland, it's almost like the dark reflection of Swan and Joshua's relationship. Like, Swan and Josh very much have a father-daughter relationship, whereas the relationship between Macklin and Roland is much colder, and it's much more of like they're just partners in this, rather than they're actually being a love for each other. Although it does imply that there is sort of a love for each other, but again, it's not on the same level as the love that Swan and Josh have for each other. And in the novel, Swan very much becomes a force of creation and life, whereas the Army of Excellence becomes a force of destruction and death. Now, Colonel Macklin is an interesting character where he's somewhat sympathetic in the beginning of the novel. You realize that he was the victim of child abuse, and when he was in Vietnam, he was actually held as a POW, where he was tortured. And it's these things that sort of hardened him and started to kill his humanity. And you find out at the beginning of the story that he's a seriously psychologically damaged individual where he's actually having visions of some kind of shadowy figure that he calls the Shadow Soldier. Almost like a boogeyman-like figure that haunts him. But after the nuclear war happens, and you see him and Roland trying to survive, anything that was left of his soul ends up getting destroyed, and by the second half of the novel, he's a full-fledged warlord. And because he's inflicted with something called Job's Mask, I'll explain what that is in a little bit, by the second half of the novel, he ends up becoming more of a monster than an actual man. In essence, he does become the Shadow Soldier by the end of the story. He becomes his own boogeyman. And there's some obvious Nazi parallels with the character of Colonel Macklin, where when he first forms the Army of Excellence, he actually does put on a Nazi uniform out of necessity. And what makes Macklin a scary villain, even scarier than the Man with the Scarlet Eye, is if something like this really did happen, yeah, I could totally see somebody like Colonel Macklin coming to power and people following him. And then you have the character of Roland Crowinger, who on one level you do almost feel sorry for because he was a child when all this started, and this entire situation destroyed whatever innocence he could have had. At the same time, you realize that even before the nuclear war, this kid was already kinda fucked up. Like, you find out that when Roland was in middle school, he actually killed the pet hamsters of a kid who was bullying him by putting the hamsters in acid. So you really do get the idea that even if this nuclear war never happened, he probably would have become a serial killer. But there are these little moments in the story because you realize that Roland basically stripped away whatever life he had prior to the nuclear war, and he even forgot about his own parents. But there are these little moments where you get the idea that he does genuinely want parental love, the kind of love that Macklin is incapable of giving him. Now, to go back to the protagonist of the novel, Sister is a really interesting character where you realize that prior to all this happening, she was fucking crazy. Now, you realize that there was an event in her life that drove her crazy, but after the bombs drop, it's almost like shock therapy in a way where it shocked her into reality. But you get the idea that the reason Sister is going on this mission that this ring is sending her on is she feels that it's sort of her redemption or her penance for what she did in the past that sort of drove her crazy. Now, as far as the other characters in the novel go, he's not necessarily one of the main antagonists, but there's this minor villain in the story named Lord Alvin, who is a pretty interesting character. Also, in the second half of the novel, Swan gets a love interest, a teenage boy named Robin, and I hate to say it, as much as I do love the book, I felt like the romance between him and Swan felt a little trite. Like, he was actually a good character on his own, but the whole love story between him and Swan felt like it would have fit way more at home in a young adult novel. Now, Swan Song, very much like The Stand, has a lot of religious undertones. I mean, the fact that the main villain is a demon, granted, not every story about demons is inherently religious, but there is the heavy implication that the Man with the Scarlet Eye is not just a demon, but is actually Lucifer himself. himself. Although you get the idea that even he doesn't know who or what he is or where he comes from. And while he's definitely meant to represent the devil in the story, he's almost less of a religious devil and more of an esoteric embodiment of evil. But also in the story you have Sister, who believes that God gave her this magic ring, and also you really do get the idea that Swan was basically chosen by God to be the savior of humanity. Like, she's not necessarily like the second coming of Christ, but the story does almost portray her as sort of a messianic figure. Also in the story, some of the survivors develop what's known as Job's Mask, which is basically these hard blisters that form over the heads of some of the survivors, and at first it appears that Job's Mask is an effect of the radiation, but later on in the story you very much get the idea that Job's Mask is literally a divine judgment. Also, there's a character who shows up towards the end of the novel who actually claims to be God. Now, whether he is or not, you have to read the book to find out. Now, while Swan Song is definitely one of the most brutal and bleakest post-apocalyptic novels I ever read, it's not completely nihilistic, because really what it is it's a story about hope, and finding hope even in the most hopeless of situations. And the book very much has an anti-war theme. Like, you realize it was war and man's aggression towards each other that eventually led the world to the situation it's in the novel, and yet even after the nuclear apocalypse, you still see people fighting and fighting as if war is just this horrible perpetual thing. Also, it's implied that throughout human history, the man with the Scarlet Eye has been influencing humanity to eventually get to this point, so the book is basically saying that war is literally the work of the devil. But the book is also very much about hope and redemption. It really is a great book, and it's definitely one of my favorite post-apocalyptic novels. Now, while there never was a TV show or a movie based on this book, there was a short film from several years ago called Road to Wasteland, which was supposed to be set within the universe of Swan Song. You could actually see it on Robert McCammon's YouTube channel. Also, in the novel, there's a town called Mary's Rest, and in the 90s, I think, there was a heavy metal band called Mary's Rest, and they had a demo tape called Shadow Soldiers, and just look at the cover here. I think they were definitely influenced by Swan Song. Also, I discovered a metal band on YouTube several years ago that actually did several songs based on this book. Now, while Swan Song was clearly influenced by The Stand, there are several post-apocalyptic novels that came after this that I think might have been influenced by Swan Song. Like, the Justin Cronin novel The Passage reminded me a lot of Swan Song, and then there's also the book The Girl with All the Gifts, which also seems to be somewhat similar to Swan Song, where it's a post-apocalyptic novel, but you have this little girl who might be the savior of humanity. But yeah, that was my review on Swan Song by Robert R. McCammon, and bye.